Hi, let's talk about the tetrapods. So tetrapods are the land vertebrates. Tetrapods have, tetra means four, and pod is foot, so tetrapods have 4 limbs and feet with digits. Tetrapods also have a neck, which might not be obvious, but think of a fish. Fish don't have a neck, they can't turn their head and look. That was an adaptation of the tetrapod. So it's one of the things that scientists look for when they're looking at the transition between lobe-finned fish and the early tetrapods. In order to stabilize walking, tetrapods also needed to attach a way to attach the legs to the spine. So unlike in fish, where the pelvis only connects the 2 lobe fins, instead the pelvic girdle also connects to the backbone for walking stability. Very few tetrapods have gills. Some amphibians have gills either only in their embryonic or only in their larval stage. A very, very few have gills that persist into adulthood, like the axolotl. But almost all tetrapods, those pharyngeal arches form other structures of the head and neck and ear, and don't form gills at all. So this is our discovered missing link, Tiktalik, which means in the local language where it was found, Tiktalik means the walking fish. It has both fish and tetrapod characteristics and lived around 380 million years ago. The scientists who discovered it did so by realizing that, okay, we have these lobe-finned fish and we have these early tetrapods that were amphibians, and we don't have any fossils in between. That's the missing link, right? We don't have any fossils in between. Well, how old would those fossils be? Well, they would be between 350 and 400 million years old, and we would want to look at sedimentary rocks from shallow seas or shallow lakes and rivers. So where in the world can we find fossils that are the right age and that would also have been not deep ocean sedimentary rocks, but shallow water sedimentary rocks? That's where we would expect to find this. And it turned out that in northern Canada there was areas that fit the bill. And so they went looking for fossils in these rocks that were the right age and very quickly found many different species of intermediate forms between lobe-finned fish and early tetrapods. And this was the first one that they found. And it still has fins, although if we look at the bony structure inside of the lobe fin, it more resembles a tetrapod than it does a lobe-finned fish. So, and we can even see that bone structure. So in our forelimbs, we have 1 bone, 2 bones, some little bones, and then digits. And we can see that same structure in Tiktalik. We have 1 bone, 2 bones, some little bones, and then the very beginning of some digits. Now, Tiktalik probably did not live on land. It was not an amphibian that came later that could truly walk on land. It probably walked in shallow water, went in and out, probably walked on the bottom in shallow water. But that's what this means, that it was a transitional form. This was not a true tetrapod. This was an intermediate fossil that was a creature that was on its way to being a tetrapod. So here, if we look at the lineage here with our closest fish outgroup here, lungfish are lobe-finned fish, and so were these other ones here. So we have, and notice the timeline here. So here we have the Permian and at the end of this is the Permian extinction here. So this is before the age of the dinosaurs. We have the white band here indicates whether that species was alive at that time or not. So lungfishes are still around, so their white bar continues all the way to the present because there still are lungfishes. Some of these other ones were quite short-lived. With Tiktalik, we only fossils have been found in a very narrow time window for Tiktalik. And then there's a few other ones here, Acanthostega and Tulerpiton. Are also intermediates between true lobe-finned fish here. These are extinct lobe-finned fish and the first amphibians. So Acanthostega and Tulerpiton were also not true amphibians yet. They were not true tetrapods yet. They were on their way. They still had some fishy characteristics. So the very first amphibians had a bone structure just like we have today. We still have a more kind of a primitive structure in our limbs. But we can see in our forelimb that one bone, two bones, little bones, the wrist bones, and then digits. And we can see that advancing here. So here is what a lungfish digit looks like. We can see that this is in the fin, so we can see that there's bones and muscles inside of the fin, but it doesn't really look like a tetrapod digit. We have some of these later extinct lobe-finned lineages, including Tiktalik here, which is almost a tetrapod. We have the beginnings of this structure with the one bone, two bones, and then the very beginning of the digits. And if we look down here to Tulerpiton, we can see that structure pretty clearly. One bone, two bones, wrist bones, and digits. And it used to be thought that the 5 digits was ancestral, but now that we have more complete fossils of these extinct groups, it's clear that they had a lot of variation in digit number, and 7 and even 9 digits. Of course, the digits don't fossilize very well, so it's a rare fossil that would have all the digits present to be able to count them. But ones that are alive today, 5 digits is not the only number, but it seems to be the standard number. So these creatures, Acanthostega and Tulerpiton, these probably didn't live on land either. These were probably creatures that could crawl up onto the land, but probably still spent most of their time in water and weren't supporting their weight very well on land the way that amphibians today do. So this Ichthyostega has been known for, oh gosh, since the 1800s. This is now considered to be one of the first definitive amphibians, definitely a tetrapod, and probably could spend most of its time on land and just return to the water for egg laying and breeding. Probably had a wet skin like amphibians today, and probably did some of its gas exchange through its skin, although probably also had lungs the way amphibians today, almost all amphibians today have lungs, although their lungs aren't that great. Their lungs don't have alveoli, so they don't have the surface area of reptile or mammal or bird lungs. They're much more just like sacs, but they also have slow metabolic rates, so they don't need as much oxygen. The 3 groups of amphibians that are alive today, there are no direct descendants of Ichthyostega still around today. You can see that would be interesting if there were. Instead, these are the 3 groups of living amphibians, so let's talk about them. Frogs are probably the most familiar. Over 90% of amphibians that are alive today are frogs. Toad is not a phylogenetic category. It is not a clade. Toad is just a name for ugly frogs. So frogs that are ugly or warty or dry or lumpy are often called toads. But they're all frogs. They're all really in the order Anura, which means no tail or tailless. Salamanders are probably the next most one. They're very often confused with lizards. I see all the time people showing images of a salamander and calling it a lizard, or a lizard and calling it a salamander. They just superficially resemble each other. Salamanders don't have scales. They are not closely related to lizards, not any more closely related than any other amphibian. But they, they have that basic tetrapod body plan, and they probably look the most like the most ancient amphibians, who were much larger. The Ichthyostega was huge and probably weighed 50 or 60 pounds at maturity. We don't have any amphibians like that today. Some salamanders don't even have lungs because they exclusively use their skin for gas exchange, and all amphibians today need to keep their skin somewhat moist because they use their skin for gas exchange. Now, there are some frogs that can tolerate a bit of dryness on their skin, like our toads, American toads, which can tolerate being quite dry on their skin because they use their lungs for exchange, for gas exchange. The order of amphibians that you probably haven't heard of are the legless amphibians, or the apoda, the Sicilians. There aren't any Sicilians that are native to Illinois or the United States. They live in tropical and subtropical areas. They burrow in the soil, and they have lost their legs during the course of evolution for the same reason that snakes lost their legs, and there are legless lizards, that it seems that during natural selection, burrowing in the soil as a ecological niche seems to cause a reduction or even a total loss of legs, that apparently legs inhibit you from squeezing through burrows in the soil. So Sicilians are burrowing, and even if you lived someplace where they were native, you might never see one because they're not that big, and they would be mistaken sometimes for worms because that's what they look like. They kind of look like a big fat earthworm. Some of them are aquatic and swim, and they're really a quite interesting and weird group of amphibians. So amphibian means that they need water. So they need water for their eggs because their eggs will dry out. Almost all amphibians lay their eggs in water and have external fertilization in the water, and embryos develop inside of a jelly-like layer that will dry out. There are some tropical species that don't lay their eggs in water, but they still have to lay their eggs in extremely moist environments because the eggs will dry out. They have no protection from drying out. Most amphibians have a larval stage, which for frogs we call a tadpole. Salamanders also have a larval stage with gills, and very often this larval stage is just an algae-eating growing stage. But there are some carnivorous tadpoles as well, and we'll talk about one. Actually, the bullfrogs that we dissected in lab, their tadpoles are carnivorous, and so are adult bullfrogs, actually. They will eat absolutely anything they can fit in their mouth, including birds and lizards and snakes and all kinds of stuff, and mice. So when they change from their, remember the definition of a larval stage, it means it has to look completely different from the adult and possibly have a completely different ecological niche. So for amphibians, not all amphibians have a larval stage. There are frogs that don't have tadpoles, for example. And the same with salamanders. There are salamanders that don't have a larval stage, and we call them direct developing. They hatch out looking like a little miniature adult. But most frogs have a larval stage. And we call that the change from the larval stage to the adult stage, metamorphosis. And this is what it looks like for a common frog. This frog, I believe, is a green frog, it's called. That's the species name. They actually live around here. As a tadpole, they're much more fish-like. They have gills. They don't have lungs. You can see the nice banded muscles here in the tail. The adult form start to grow legs, and the tail is reabsorbed, and the gills close, and then eventually they have to gulp air. Although the transition isn't that hard for them, because remember, amphibians can do gas exchange through their skin. So a small tadpole can probably survive as its gills are closing and its lungs are still forming pretty easily. But they need water. They either need a watery environment, a real water to lay their eggs in, or if it's a tropical environment that's like a rainforest. There are a lot of frogs that don't lay their eggs in water. They lay their eggs high in the trees in little pockets and stuck to leaves and things, because it's moist enough, the air is humid enough that they don't dry out. The next stage in the evolution of vertebrates then is the evolution of an egg that can tolerate land. And that's the amniotic egg. So the amniote is a membrane that surrounds the developing embryo to keep it from drying out. And that was an evolutionary innovation that allowed tetrapods to adapt to drier and drier environments, because they didn't need to lay their eggs in water or even wet environments in order to survive. So here's the amniote lineage. So here we have the ancestral amniote. So the first vertebrate that had an egg that was protected by this outer amniotic membrane to prevent water loss. And that eventually evolved into the shell. So the first amniotic egg was kind of like a leathery or parchment kind of eggs, they're sometimes called. There are some reptiles today that still have eggs like this that don't have a calcified shell. Instead, they just have this kind of leathery, rubbery kind of amnion. So there was a very early branch in the amniotes, the synapsids, which led to mammals, and the diapsids. And these two names refer to the skull, and I'll show you a skull in a minute to show you what it means, but it referred to holes in the skull, something that would be visible in the fossil record that we could identify these two lineages. The diapsids were the reptiles, and the reptiles again broke into several early lineages. The archosaurs, and again we see that root that means first, so probably whoever first defined this lineage thought that these were the ancestral reptiles or the ancestral diapsids, or possibly even they're referring to the dinosaurs, and that this was the lineage leading to the dinosaurs. And then the lepidosaurs, which leads to the lizards and snakes, and one weird group that we'll talk about. And then you can see there's a couple of extinct lineages, and then we see this common symbol that we see all the time in both in archaeology and in paleontology, and that is this little cross that means they are extinct. So besides the archosaurs and the lepidosaurs, we also have the plesiosaurs and the ichthyosaurs, and you'll notice this looks a lot like the Loch Ness Monster. So no, there's no Loch Ness Monster. That's been underwater radar and submarines and scanning technology have proved that the idea that there's a plesiosaur living in a lake in Scotland was a fanciful way to attract tourists, but it wasn't real. There's no ichthyosaurs either, although ichthyosaurs are a really cool example of convergent evolution with dolphins and whales. Ichthyosaurs readapted to the sea. Plesiosaurs readapted to the sea, just like whales did from a four-legged land ancestor. Okay, so we'll talk about the archosaurs, which led to the dinosaurs and then ultimately to the birds. And the closest living relatives of the dinosaurs, other than birds, include crocodilians and turtles. Interestingly, turtles have been another thorn in the side of zoologists before DNA. Where in the world do the turtles belong? They are so weird for reptiles. They have so many skeletal traits that just don't put them anywhere, including not having a diapsid skull. Where in the world do they belong? Are they some weird basal lineage? Now we know, thanks to DNA, where they belong. And in fact, they are close relatives, well, as close as you can be, with a distant past. They are cousins to the crocodiles and then ultimately to the birds. And not so closely related to lizards, which they were formerly put with the lizards before DNA. They were thought to be a sister clade to lizards, and that turns out that is not true. But we'll talk about those as well. Okay, so the main derived character of the amniote lineage is the amniotic egg. And of course, this still applies to ones that have evolved with placenta, like mammals. That amnion is still one of the membranes that forms around the embryo and becomes part of the placenta and the extraembryonic membranes. So the amnion encloses the embryo in a fluid-filled sac and keeps it from drying out, so that it doesn't prevent all water loss in egg-laying reptiles, but it drastically slows the water loss, because of course the egg shell or the amnion is not completely sealed, because gas exchange has to occur. There are holes even in a calcified chicken egg, which is a very hard eggshell compared to a reptile eggshell. Most reptile eggs are kind of rubbery. There are holes in the shell on a microscopic level that allow gas exchange. So of course that's going to allow water to evaporate. It just drastically slows the rate of water evaporation, giving the little embryo time to develop and hatch before the egg dries out. So here's a reptile egg, and if you have studied human embryonic anatomy at all, you will recognize some of these names, because we retain these same tissues, only now they're found inside the uterus surrounding the developing embryo. So here's our little developing reptile, whatever this is, and we have a yolk sac, and the yolk sac in well, what's left of it, we don't really have any yolk. What's left of the ancestral yolk sac in mammals forms part of the umbilical cord, which kind of makes sense, right? We have chorion and the amniotic sac itself, and the amniotic fluid. You've all heard of that before, probably. Many eggs also have a protein layer, so the white of the egg, of a chicken egg, is mostly protein. It's just albumin, and the embryo can also absorb that and use that. The egg yolk is the actual egg. So all of these structures other than the amnion are formed from the embryonic tissue and the yolk itself. So reptiles are the basal amniotes. And the first reptiles, this is a reconstruction of one of the most ancient reptiles from the fossil record. Their eggs didn't fossilize very well because they didn't have a calcified shell. So we have very, very few fossil examples of these early reptile eggs. But the shell was probably more like parchment paper and not hard at all. So reptiles include quite a variety. They tend to have scales. So tuataras, which we'll talk about, are very weird. Lizards, snakes, turtles, crocodiles, and birds. Because remember, if we don't include birds, then that makes reptiles paraphyletic. If we're going to include all the descendants of the first reptile ancestor, the first diapsid ancestor, as a single clade, then we have to keep the birds in there. Although reptiles are in order and aves is in order, and that's also not good to have one order inside of another order. If you're going to lay an egg with a barrier, that also means that fertilization has to take place before the shell is made in the oviduct of the female. So that necessitated internal fertilization as well. So reptiles and all the amniotes have internal fertilization, because you can't have external fertilization if you lay an egg that has a shell on it. Amphibians, most amphibians have external fertilization. Their eggs are not, there's no barrier to sperm around the egg. But the amnion is a barrier to sperm, so fertilization has to be internal. But the advantage to that, the advantage to laying eggs with a waterproof barrier and not having external fertilization, you don't need water. You can have reproduction in dry terrestrial environments, and that was a big advantage. So fertilization, so the yolk is the egg. The yolk is what comes out of the ovary of the female. Then fertilization occurs. Then if there is an albumin layer, that is secreted by the oviduct, and that goes on the egg. And then the amnion is secreted, and that surrounds the egg. And then if there's a calcified shell, that is secreted last. So those are all secreted by the oviduct of the female. So the egg is the yolk. Fertilization occurs right after ovulation, before all of those extra embryonic tissues and structures get secreted on there. So diapsids, all the living reptiles and the early reptiles were diapsids, and that refers to the holes in the skull. So here is a stop. So that refers to the holes in the skull. The di tells you that there's two. So here is the eye socket, and there's two other holes for muscles. There's muscles that pass through here. So that's a diapsid. And of the living reptiles, I think only turtles actually don't have any of these holes. They only have an eye socket, and they don't have any holes. And so that's why it was unsure where to put them, because they're obviously reptiles, but they didn't have like the main reptile characteristic, which was having two holes in the skull behind the eye socket. So one weird lineage in the Lepidosaurs is the Tuataras. There's only two species left. They only live in New Zealand. They have been extirpated from the mainland when humans showed up, because humans showed up with rats. The native New Zealanders are related to other Polynesians. And Polynesians, people think now, scientists think that they may have brought rats with them intentionally as food. Because if you land on an island that has no mammals, which most Pacific islands had no native mammals, the only thing that you can eat is birds and fish. But if you bring rats with you and you let the rats go, the rats will find food, and the rats will multiply, and then eventually you can trap and eat the rats after a few years. So rats came to New Zealand when the first humans showed up in New Zealand about 30,000 years ago, and that caused an extirpation. Would you guys stop? That's enough. That caused an extirpation of the Tuataras from the mainland, the two big islands of New Zealand. But they're found on quite a few of the small islands still where people didn't settle. And they're now very extraordinarily protected. And in fact, scientists who study them do so in cooperation with the indigenous tribes who consider themselves now to be the guardians of these rare and weird lizard-like reptiles. They actually have the so-called third eye visible on top of their head. This picture doesn't show it, but we're going to talk about it later when we talk about the brain later in the semester. The pineal gland is in the center of our brain. And in reptiles and amphibians, because they have such a small cerebrum, the pineal gland is actually really close to the surface and is only covered by a very thin layer of skull and skin. Well, in the Tuataras, there's actually a hole in their skull, and the little pineal gland is right under the skin. And the reason that that's important is because you might know the pineal gland makes melatonin and is part of the circadian rhythm. So our pineal gland cannot detect light directly because we have too much brain covering it and it's in complete darkness. So it gets a signal from our eyes, whether it's light or dark. But in the Tuatara and most amphibians and reptiles, the pineal gland senses light directly through the skull. And in the case of the Tuatara, you can actually see it on the surface of their head. It looks weird. I will show you a picture of it when we get to the brain section. The other lepidosaurs are the very common reptiles that we're all familiar with, lizards and snakes. This is another little mystery that DNA solved, is whether snakes and lizards are closely related or whether snakes are another weird separate lineage like turtles. And it turns out that lizards and snakes are all part of the same lineage. The squamates are the lizards, and their leglessness has apparently evolved multiple times during the course of lizard evolution, because not only do we have the snake lineage, the snake clade, which is an ancient clade, but we have much more recent instances among the lizards multiple times where a particular clade has lost their legs because they're burrowing mostly. The archosaurs, so that root again means first. So this could be, I don't know for sure why this particular lineage was named that, if they were thought originally to be the most ancient reptiles, or if it was just because this lineage leads to the dinosaurs and they were like the oldest dinosaur lineage. I don't know. But there are some extinct archosaurs that were not dinosaurs, like the pterosaurs. The pterosaurs were the first tetrapods to fly and not just glide. So they were the first tetrapods with powered flight. So bats have powered flight. Today, they're the mammals who achieved powered flight, but the pterosaurs were before them. Flying has many advantages, which we'll talk about when we get to birds. Why has flight evolved so many times? It must have an advantage because it certainly has a lot of costs. Flying is extremely energetically expensive, and it must have a huge benefit to evolve. The dinosaurs are extremely well documented in the fossil record because, you know, they have calcified skeletons, although we keep learning more about them as some of the things that don't fossilize very well continue to be discovered in very interesting deposits, like the theropods, which were the bipedal carnivorous dinosaurs, including tyrannosaurs and velociraptors were theropods. There were also very many small theropods that were, you know, bird size. And it's thought now that all the theropod dinosaurs had feathers. They are the ancestors of birds. And all of the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, except birds. Since if we make dinosaurs a clade, a monophyletic clade, birds have to be included in that clade if it's a monophyletic clade. And so birds are the surviving dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs that survived the Great Extinction Event 65 million years ago. Evidence very strong evidence points to that extinction event being caused by an asteroid. It's often called the KT extinction because Cretaceous, the person who first talked about the mass extinction, was German. Cretaceous in German starts with K. So KT extinction event 65 million years ago. There is a huge ancient crater, impact crater in the Yucatan Peninsula that is 65 million years old. It's the right size to be from an impact crater that could have killed the dinosaurs. This is now thought to have been an extremely rapid event, not something. The Permian extinction is thought to have taken maybe 10,000 years to occur. The KT extinction is thought now to have been extremely rapid, and most of the extinction may have occurred in a single day, a single calamitous day on Earth, which is a really interesting story, which I wish we had more time to go into. I have to post a video. I have a video that goes into more detail that's really cool. So the archosaurs, turtles we now know from DNA, belong in the archosaurs. And this is great because turtles were a mystery for a long time. Turtles don't have any holes in their skull other than for their eyes and their nostrils. So it was a mystery. Where do we put them? Are they a weird ancient lineage, from the original amniote? Are they even reptiles? Where do we put them? But now we know that just during the course of evolution, they were diapsids, and they have lost those two holes because now there are ancient fossil turtles that had a partially evolved shell. So the shell of a turtle is actually part of their skeleton. And we have ancient turtle fossils now that only have a partial shell and still have the two holes in their skull. So they are definitely diapsids. They just lost those holes during the course of evolution. You're not going out. Stop that. Stop it. The crocodilians are, other than birds, the closest living relatives of the dinosaurs. Alligators are crocodiles. Alligator is a subcategory of crocodile. So all the crocodiles are crocodilians, and all the alligators are also crocodilians. They used to live in a huge variety of climates. They were around the entire time the dinosaurs were around. Crocodilians have been around more than 250 million years. They're extremely ancient, and they used to live in a big variety of climates, and now they're mostly confined to tropical and subtropical areas and wet environments. Although they do lay their eggs on land, they have other traits in common with birds that other reptiles do not have, such as a significant amount of parental care, a four-chambered heart, and they also, interestingly, have endothermy. They don't maintain a absolutely consistent body temperature like birds do, but they do maintain a more stable internal body temperature than most other reptiles do. So interesting, they're kind of halfway in between completely being an ectotherm like most lizards and being a complete endotherm like birds. But we'll talk more about that in another chapter. So birds are directly descended from the theropod dinosaurs. We now think that theropod dinosaurs all had feathers. The birds themselves have several interesting derived characters that some of them are also found in the theropods, but are also good adaptations for flight, like having hollow bones. It was originally thought that only birds had hollow bones. Now we know many theropod dinosaurs also had hollow bones. They also have, they lack urinary bladder. If you're carrying around a big sack of fluid, that's not very good for flight. Females usually only have a single ovary. They save weight in a lot of other ways. Some even think that the fact that birds don't have any teeth and they lost their teeth during the course of evolution, that was weight saving as well. Although I think that hypothesis is a little more iffy. So bird forelimbs are extremely modified. They have lost 2 of the 5 digits. So if we number these digits, if your thumb is digit 1, as we have here, digit 1, that's the thumb. They have lost digits 4 and 5 completely, and digits 2 and 3 are extremely reduced and are not used as digits, although in some ancient birds, these were actually claws. And there actually is a couple of bird species, now that I think about it, some weird primitive birds that still have claws on their wings. There's always something. You can't make any general rule in biology without there being something. That it's the rule somewhere. Scientists can tell by looking at fossil feathers whether a bird had the capability of flight or not, because flight feathers are different from other feathers. Birds that had powered flight, their feathers are asymmetrical, and if you ever find a feather on the ground, look at this, that the barbs on either side of the feather, they're asymmetrical, and they are shorter on the side that faces forward than the side that faces back, and that's what makes them able to fly. So why has flight evolved? There are certainly a lot of birds that live around predators, namely ostriches, that cannot fly and have very reduced wings. There are large flightless birds in Australia, in South America, and birds seem to lose their ability to fly when they live on islands without land predators, and that gives us one big hint as to why flying first evolved. Because if on islands where there's no mammal predators, birds tend to lose their ability to fly, because flying is expensive. Flying is very energetically expensive. And if your food's on the ground, not in the trees, what are you flying for if there's no predators? So that was one reason birds evolved flight, was to escape predators. The other reason birds evolved flight was to obtain food that was not easily obtainable any other way. But flying is very expensive. It's energetically extremely expensive, and it's costly in other ways, because you have to, as the body evolves to be very light, other things are lost. Other abilities are lost. So not all birds have, some birds have lost their flight for so long, they're very large bodied, like ostriches. Ostriches are, instead of flying, they're extremely fast, and they're also very strong, and they can kill a person by kicking them. So now it's thought, because of a whole bunch of fantastic fossils that have come out of China since the 1990s, that all theropod dinosaurs were feathered. So that includes all the velociraptors and T-Rex, and all of them had feathers, and possibly other dinosaurs as well. So, and you can find many images from the Jurassic Park movies where artists have fixed them. These were discovered, so after the first Jurassic Park movie, then it was discovered that velociraptors were probably covered with feathers and had long feathers on their forelimbs, probably for display purposes. And the movie producers did not want to fix it, because they thought people would be confused. Number one, they said, if we suddenly change the predators to being covered with feathers, people will be confused. And they also said that the more reptilian-looking predator was more scary. So when you watch Jurassic Park now, keep in mind that T-Rex and the velociraptors had feathers. And so here's one of those things. This is from, I can't remember which Jurassic Park movie this was, where he was training the velociraptors, but somebody fixed them to make them feathered. So why did feathers evolve when there was no flight? It probably the exact same reason that Hair evolved in early mammals, and that is for insulation, because theropod dinosaurs and mammals are warm-blooded, and being warm-blooded and endothermic is very metabolically expensive. And so you need to have some kind of insulation to keep that heat in to save energy. So having a hairy body like a mammal saves energy. Having a feathery body in a theropod dinosaur saves energy, because you can keep that heat that you're generating with your high metabolism, you can keep it in. And probably that led to colors, although we have no idea about colors, although certainly they've been able to look at some of these fossil feathers from the theropod dinosaurs and figure out that some of them had stripes across their feathers because the melanocytes get preserved. So stripes across their feathers like hawks do today. But, you know, if any of them had any other colors, we have no idea. But we might in the future. But it's a very cool story how much theropod dinosaurs were like birds. So here is the still considered to be the oldest fossil bird. So when do we call it a bird? So if we had these theropod dinosaurs running around on two legs, some of them were very small. They were jumping around in the tree branches, using their feathers to glide from tree branch to tree branch. At what point do we call them birds? Well, we consider, scientists have drawn the line at flapping flight. So when they could flap their wings and have powered flight, now it's a bird. And Archaeopteryx is still the original bird. So here we see, you know, very long tail with lots of vertebrae, very unlike birds today. Birds today have really short tails, and most of the tail that you see on birds today is just feathers. Their actual tail is really small. Archaeopteryx still had teeth. Birds today don't have teeth, although they still have scales. Birds still have scales on their legs, and some birds have scales on their heads as well. They had claws. They hadn't lost the claws on their first few digits yet, and there's a couple of weird primitive birds still around today that still have I can't remember if it's one or two claws on their wings. I think those are ratites. So flight started as these small little theropod dinosaurs up in the trees, sort of like flying squirrels. They were not really flapping their wings. They were just soaring and jumping from tree to tree and kind of gliding. And then eventually that evolved into flapping flight. And then eventually we have Archaeopteryx, who could probably take off from the ground and flap its wings and fly. That's a bird. Birds can take off. Now, there's quite a few bird lineages that have lost that ability, like penguins, you know, but most birds today can still do that. So living birds today, there are some weird living birds, but we now know because of DNA again, that living birds, even really primitive, weird birds, which belong to the clade called the ratites, they're odd. They're all a single monophyletic clade, all the birds that are alive today. Although there are quite a few flightless birds, they all evolved from a bird that could fly. So there's, just like there are legless lizards that had ancestors that had legs, there are flightless birds today, but they all had an ancestor who could fly. So the ancestral bird could fly. That's why it's a bird, not a dinosaur. We even have weird things like penguins. And I run into people even today occasionally who don't know that penguins are birds because they're so weird compared to other birds. But they're definitely right within the bird clade. They're not even an outlying basal group or a sister group. So we're going to end this video talking about the more basal mammals. So mammals is, of course, our lineage. We are mammals. And mammals have mammary glands. Mammary glands produce milk, so that is the defining characteristic of mammals, is that mammals produce milk to feed their newborns. Mammals also have hair ancestrally, although there are some animal lineages that have completely lost their hair as adults, like the whales. Although, interestingly, whales, when they are fetuses, have hair, and then they lose it before they're born. Mammals also store their fat under their skin and can use it as an insulating layer. As you saw when we were dissecting our frogs, frogs do not store their fat as a subcutaneous layer. Frogs store their fat on those long, strand-like fat bodies, which we're not going to provide them any kind of insulation. Mammals have an advanced kidney that functions differently than bird kidneys or reptile kidneys, as we'll see when we get to that chapter. We'll talk more about kidneys and what makes a mammal kidney different from other kidneys. Mammals are all endothermic and have a fairly high metabolic rate. Mammals have a very efficient respiratory system that has very high surface area in the lungs. We have alveoli inside of our lungs that provide an extremely high surface area for gas exchange. And again, inside of our lungs has to be wet for gas exchange. Four-chambered heart, good circulatory system, large brain-to-body ratio, extensive parental care, and differentiated teeth. And this is an important one because this is one way that paleontologists distinguish early primitive mammal fossils from reptile fossils, because very often when we're finding fossils, we don't find very much. And because the lower and upper jaw are among the hardest bones in the body and teeth are among the hardest bones in the body, very often with fossils, the only thing that we find are teeth or a little piece of jaw with a few teeth in it. How do you know if it's a mammal or a reptile? Well, one of the big giveaways is if there's differentiated teeth, if there's specialized teeth, like flat teeth in the back for grinding, pointy teeth in the front, that's a mammal. Because in reptiles and in fish, all the teeth are the same. There isn't specialized teeth for different functions. All the teeth are basically the same shape in reptiles that have teeth, fish that have teeth. So that's a derived mammalian characteristic, to have different teeth that are different shapes for different functions. So mammals are synapsids, which was a very early split in the amniotic lineage, well before the age of the dinosaurs. So synapsids only have a single hole behind the eye. Diapsids have two. That led to the whole reptile lineage and the dinosaurs and the birds. And synapsids only have a single hole. And in this, so the early synapsids did not have hair, but at some point during evolution of synapsids to mammals, instead of scales, they evolved hair, which was more insulating. And if you're going to be endothermic, insulation is good. The other big thing that happened during the course of evolution was the evolution of the jaw joint. And that's another big distinguishing feature of early mammals. So here we have a synapsid, so not a mammal yet, but in the mammal lineage. And we see that one big hole here, but here's the eye socket. One big hole that makes it a synapsid, and multiple bones in the jaw joint, which reptiles still have to this day. But during the course of evolution, mammals lost these little bones in the jaw, and instead these little bones ended up in the ear. And so mammals have excellent hearing compared to other vertebrates. Because remember, fish don't have ears. So the first tetrapods did not have ears. Marine and aquatic vertebrates get sound kind of all over their whole body through the water. It wasn't until tetrapods moved onto the land that it became necessary to now be able to detect sounds through the air, which is a much less dense medium and requires a different specialized sense organ. So ears evolved in tetrapods. And one of the things that happened in the mammal lineage was two bones that used to be part of the articulation of the upper and lower jaw ended up as the incus and the malleus in the inner ear. And the stapes has a different embryonic origin. The most primitive mammals are the monotremes. There are only a few species left, I think 4 species of monotremes. The echidnas, or the spiny anteaters, they're no relation to any other anteaters, and the platypus. And I think there are 2 species of echidnas and 2 species of platypus, if I remember right, and they're only found in Australia and nearby Australia. And they are mammals because they make milk to feed their babies. They do lay eggs, and this is what one of their eggs looks like. So the females lay eggs and incubate the eggs with their body's warmth. And when the babies hatch, the females have mammary glands developed evolutionarily from modified sweat glands. So monotremes have these little specialized sweat glands on their bellies, the females do, that secrete milk. And the babies lap it up with their tongues. So that was the most primitive type of milk production. It evolved from a sweat gland to feed the newly hatched little babies. So those are the monotremes. They're the most basal and primitive mammals. So we would suppose that, based on where they are in the mammal lineage, that the first mammals were like monotremes and laid eggs. The second step in the evolution of mammals was, instead of laying eggs, keeping those babies internally during the early embryonic stages. And for marsupials, so the marsupia, that is the pouch. So marsupials have a pouch. They're the pouched mammals. And again, these are mostly found in Australia and New Zealand and around there. Very few marsupials are found in the rest of the world. We only have one marsupial that's native to the United States. Stop! I'm going to throw another pen. Shh. That's the possum. So what happens with marsupials? They do have a placenta, but it's a very inefficient placenta. It doesn't really do much for the baby. So the babies have to be born when they're really still an embryo. So this is a newborn possum. You can see the eyes are still developing. It's totally blind. The hind limbs are still developing. It barely has functional forelimbs, although they can crawl, because when they're born, they're so tiny, and then they have to crawl through the mother's fur up into the pouch, and then they latch onto a teat, and they don't let go. They kind of latch on for another pregnancy inside the pouch. People sometimes call that the second pregnancy for marsupials. The little babies stay in the pouch for a few months until they eventually can survive outside of the pouch. And they have to be born so early because marsupials really have a very inefficient placenta. Okay, so those are the 2 basal groups of mammals, the egg-laying mammals, the monotremes, and the pouch mammals, the marsupials. And next we'll talk about what's often called the placental mammals, or the eutherians, and that includes us. We'll talk about that in the next video.